The COVID-19 crisis has impacted our economy greater than any financial or real-world crisis since World War II. What type of legacy it leaves will be dependent on how local, state, and federal legislators react to the crisis. For many legislators, dealing with the financial aftermath means challenging their ideology, principles, and concepts of how an economy actually works. This means learning economic concepts in detail so they can make good decisions and emerge from this crisis in the shortest amount of time. This may mean that ingrained notions of the government and private sector dynamic change or evolve. The most productive thing that COVID-19 economic recovery teams should focus on in rebuilding our economy are those policies that will accelerate economic activity and create productivity. Simply printing money, as the Federal Reserve is doing now, is not normally enough in times where a great economic recession looms. Too much money chasing too little productivity is a recipe for economic disaster. Stimulus money is slowly being made available, but many businesses have already closed, individual credit ratings are tanking, and banks always become fearful of lending in such times. Banks that normally held a 10% reserve in good times are now expanding their reserves to 30% or more out of valid economic fears. This means less lending by banks, not more. When banks don't lend, jump-starting the economy may rest with the state. The state can issue bonds and get large projects moving that can give banks the confidence to start lending. State legislators need to look at both state and federal policies that inhibit productivity, job creation, and economic development. They need to do what they can at the state level, and they need to push federal legislators by passing state legislation that challenges long-held federal policies. Federal legislators and bureaucrats don't have to listen, but at least the state has put them on notice and signals to them an economic path they would like to travel. Such legislation allows state legislators to better work with their congressional delegation to better lobby all of Congress to realize state-led initiatives. Many state legislators all across the nation have become obedient to the dictates of Washington, D.C., and no longer press the federal government as state legislators did up until the late 1960s. Many legislators don't see the point in passing laws that challenge the federal government. Rather than be proactive and push Congress, the norm is to wait until Congress provides an opportunity. This can very much be thought of as top-down acquiescence instead of grassroots proactivism. The St. Lawrence Seaway project is a great example of state and local legislators challenging the federal government and exerting grassroots proactivism. The St. Lawrence Seaway project was one of the largest civil engineering feats ever undertaken. Construction began in the summer of 1954 and took only 5 years to complete. Over its course, the project employed some 22,000 workers and utilized enough cement to build a highway 1,000 miles long and enough steel to circumnavigate the Earth. About 6,500 people living in riverside communities had to be relocated, bridges were raised, and tunnels, dikes, and roads were constructed. Locks had to be constructed in the Seaway and modernized in the Welland Canal to raise and lower large ships, making it the world's greatest waterway lifting operation. Additionally, money was spent on deepening the Detroit and St. Clair rivers.
A system of canals and locks. Here, just outside Montreal, at Lachine, at Soulanges, and at the International Rapids section, and we could open up a whole mid-continent to ocean-going commerce.
From an engineering standpoint, it may be possible, but the cost would be prohibitive.
Yes, I'm afraid this is one of those fine dreams that will never come true. Not in our time.
And I say it can be done.
The St. Lawrence Seaway construction was supported by American presidents, but met with strong criticism in Congress and from lobbyists for railroads and Atlantic port cities, and from established businesses who feared the loss of business and other economic injuries if the waterway was completed. These erstwhile debates stymied the development of the St. Lawrence Seaway for more than 20 years. It wasn't until New York State residents and state politicians realized that if they didn't do something, the St. Lawrence project was literally dead in the water. Large D.C. lobbying groups were not running to their rescue. When Congress caved to the federal lobbyists and the voices of opposition, New York mayors, assemblymen, state senators, and New York governors kept the Seaway project in the national spotlight. They became the lobbyists of common sense and reason. Without the tireless effort of these individuals challenging federal policy and state legislators with a vision, the St. Lawrence Seaway would still be gathering dust in the archives of the Army Corps of Engineers. Hydroelectric power, more jobs created by expanded port opportunities, and national security issues championed by state legislators helped New Yorkers propel this issue into the national spotlight. The Wiley-Dondero Bill, which called for the construction of the Seaway, only gained passage in the Senate in 1954 when Congress realized that the Canadian officials, heavily influenced by New York State Assemblymen and the New York-based St. Lawrence Seaway Commission, would make good on their threat to build the Seaway alone and exclusively on the Canadian side. To put this in perspective, Canada at the time only had a population of about 15 million people compared to the state of Ohio's current 11 million people. Could we even fathom today a state like Ohio undertaking such an infrastructure project by itself without the aid of the federal government? This was the attitude of the state and Canadian leaders in the 1950s. Why is it that state leaders were so much more likely to take the bull by the horns and throw caution to the wind in our very recent past, but are unlikely to do so today? We had state leaders in New York that had a vision and challenged the federal government to do the right thing. They created the St. Lawrence Seaway Commission long before Congress looked positively on the project. The benefits that the St. Lawrence Seaway project would bring were self-evident to the state legislature. The federal government and Congress finally relented and did the right thing. This was very much a story of David versus Goliath. The established industries and big businesses did not want the competition that the completion of the St. Lawrence Seaway project would bring. The state legislature acted as lobbyists in Washington, D.C., representing small businesses and common sense.
Big day on the North American continent. The St. Lawrence Seaway is opened for business, allowing ocean-going ships to pass from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. The 2,300-mile distance from Duluth, Minnesota to the open sea is now entirely navigable. 7 locks, this one is St. Catharines, span the difference in levels between Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River at Montreal, a difference of 224 feet. A switch is thrown, opening the locks for the first ship. After 50 years of talks between the United States and Canada and 5 years of construction, the great undertaking becomes a reality. The biggest waterway that has been cut since the Panama Canal.
It was the New York State Legislature that established the St. Lawrence Power Commission and an advisory board of engineers to create the St. Lawrence Power Development Plan, not the federal government. This commission also signed agreements with the Ontario, Canada legislature for power purchase agreements before Congress agreed to allow the project to move forward. These actions by the state government helped to clear a path in Congress for legislators to say yes to the project. California and many West Coast states routinely challenged the federal government to adopt more stringent environmental laws and to put federal lands off limits to humans. So states challenging the federal government is not uncommon, even today. Additionally, although the Tennessee Valley Authority project was an FDR-led project and part of the New Deal, Tennessee and Alabama state legislators helped to usher the TVA into existence for exactly the same reasons as the St. Lawrence Seaway project: hydroelectric, cheap energy, and the additional opportunities gained by port and river access. FDR used the productivity and economic activity created by the development of the TVA to combat the economic woes of the Great Recession. Many small businesses stood to gain by the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway dams, canals, locks, hydroelectric systems, and the TVA system of dams, canals, locks, and hydroelectric systems. None of these small businesses, by themselves, could afford to lobby D.C. for these projects. Instead, they relied on the state legislature to lobby and push the federal government to do what was intuitive and self-evident to many Americans. Of course, established businesses rallied against these projects, claiming unfair competition. Coal companies, current electric generation companies, trucking, railroads, and other port towns all rallied against the additional competition these projects would create. The St. Lawrence Seaway project and the TVA project both paid for themselves, So while they were financially backed by the taxpayer, they did not use taxpayer dollars as that money was paid back with interest, and the economies of the states involved were greatly expanded.
Congress has met twice. First, to pass a $2 trillion bill that in many cases is harming the very business it purports to help. And now again to spend more borrowed money without asking the important questions. No hearings, no oversight. Today I'm holding my nose, voting for a bill I had no chance to shape because there are 700,000 businesses closed by the power of government on the outside looking in, while Harvard qualifies for $9 million. But this is it, Madam Speaker. Enough. No more half-ass legislating. No more picking winners and losers.
While it is very true that government can negatively impact the economy by picking winners and losers, and it has done so many times in its history, it is also true when the government takes on projects that are a natural evolution of the will of the private sector, it can help to greatly expand the economy. There are many examples of this in our history. The atom bomb led to the development of nuclear power and to winning World War II. Both had very positive effects on the economy. The interstate highway system helped America to greatly transform itself into an international powerhouse. Millions of people and businesses benefited from the development of the interstate highway system. The space race helped to develop many of the modern technologies that we take for granted today, and has helped in many innumerable ways to transform our economy for the better. Big businesses abhor competition and embrace regulations that push out the competition. This is harmful to the natural distribution of wealth and a healthy economy. Many times, the influence of big business at the federal level drowns out the voice of many small businesses. When this happens, the last resort is lobbying the federal government on behalf of small businesses by the state assembly or the governor's office. If the state assembly gives up on small businesses, then state economies can stagnate, languish, and falter. Today, Ohio finds itself with one of the most complex state codes in the nation. While it is true some rules and laws help to provide for better productivity, the large volume of rules and laws Ohio has historically equated to less competition and less productivity. Ohio's economy was late in bouncing back under the Trump administration due to state rules, regulations, and an unwillingness to push the envelope with Congress. Ohio is one of the more populated, industrialized manufacturing states and will more than likely have serious problems bouncing back from this economic depression as it did under the Bush-Obama recession without great changes. An example of current legislation that challenges Congress and federal bureaucrats is Ohio's House Bill 104 ANTHEM Act. This type of legislation seeks to provide more competition in the field of developing advanced nuclear reactors to consume nuclear waste and to provide medical isotopes. HB 104 has languished in the Ohio House mainly due to legislators waiting for a signal from the federal government, rather than overtly challenging Congress and federal agencies to allow for alternate and potentially accelerated development pathways for nuclear technologies. Like New York and the St. Lawrence Seaway, HB 104 would create a commission, in this case called a consortium, in the form of a public benefits corporation and an authority to make decisions in the best interests of all Ohioans. This commission and authority could lead the change in pushing the narrative in Congress of why competition and alternate development pathways can create an explosion of jobs in Ohio and around the United States. This is very different than what Ohio did in picking winners and losers when it decided to mandate wind and solar energy in 2008. HB 104 does not seek any mandates and would not cost Ohio taxpayers any money. Just like the St. Lawrence Seaway project. The commission would sell stock in a public benefits corporation, and if the stock is able to be sold in the private market, then the commission sinks or swims on its own merits. People can intuitively understand that commercializing an inherently safe technology that consumes nuclear waste and produces electricity is extremely valuable. The prospect of powering the United States on nuclear waste for several hundred years is very attractive to those on both the left and right sides of the aisle. People can understand that the United States producing its own medical and industrial radioisotopes is an important national security issue. Just as people back in the 1950s intuitively saw the benefits of creating the St. Lawrence Seaway, the public, when educated, realizes the benefits of HB 104 and advanced nuclear development. Are there detractors? Yes, there are. And there will always be detractors. There will always be detractors to the intuitively obvious. Wind and solar lobbies are certainly opposed to any technology producing a lower-cost carbon-free energy source that produces baseload power. It would almost certainly disrupt the renewables industry, make the natural gas lobby stand up and take notice, and create new lucrative yet environmentally friendly opportunities for the coal industry that would change it dramatically. Just as there were detractors that argued that the state of New York had no business getting into the hydroelectric, canal, and lock business, special interests like wind, solar, and natural gas will argue against greater competition from new nuclear technology development facilitated by the state of Ohio. If HB 104 passes into law in Ohio and Congress reacts positively, Ohio can expect the same results that happened when the St. Lawrence Seaway project was finished: a tremendous amount of productivity, economic activity, and opportunity for Ohioans and all of the Midwest states. We ask that Ohio legislators support House Bill 104 to the fullest extent possible and similar type projects that will greatly increase the productivity of Ohioans and expand the economy.